Top story begins here with the new battle lines in this impeachment probe. Very late today, just as we were coming out on the air, the White House uncorked its lengthiest and its most legal response to this impeachment probe. They're sending an 8-page letter tonight to Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and they're detailing basically what is going to be a first draft of the strategy. It's an explanation with some legalese of why the White House says they are in the right to defy most of this probe, and they're also accusing the Democrats, get this, of using impeachment oversight for 2020. Now, meanwhile, the Democrat who has really lately been the face of this whole fight, House Intelligence Chair Adam Schiff, he's calling a new move by the Trump administration, quote, strong evidence of obstruction. That would be another article of impeachment. Trump's State Department ordering a key witness in the inquiry not to testify at all to face Democrats in the House. This is someone you've probably recently heard about, Ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland. Now, when you get a sense of just how much of this is being made up on the fly at the White House, well, Mr. Sondland was flying to Washington from Brussels. He was ready to testify. This is all clearly very last minute, and it was going to be behind closed doors, a kind of a substantive thing. And then he was blocked this morning by the Trump State Department. House Democrats say they're going to subpoena Sondland to testify so that this fight only increases. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Pompeo refusing to answer reporters' questions on the basic thing everyone wants to know if you have a public event with the Secretary of State on a day like today with impeachment hitting a 10. Why won't you let Mr. Sondland testify?
Mr. Secretary, why don't you instruct Ambassador Sondland not to testify?
Thank you all. Good morning. That is what it looks like when you just walk away to duck questions. Congressman Schiff is saying the State Department is also withholding key information that Sondland has.
We are also aware that the ambassador has text messages or emails on a personal device, which have been provided to the State Department, although we have requested those from the ambassador, and the State Department is withholding those messages as well.
The New York Times also out with a story on new details from the Ukraine-Trump call, with a White House official saying, and remember, this is someone who works for Donald Trump, this thing was, quote, crazy and, quote, frightening. And the official was visibly shaken, having witnessed the President of the United States, according to the Times, engage in, quote, criminal activity. Now, congressional officials say there are even more text messages between some of these key people that the committee wants to review but have not been fully released to the public yet. And another thing about the texts that have been released, Sondland was, of course, at the center of that exchange with Ambassador Bill Taylor. He was the one who famously put in writing something to protect himself, perhaps, but also to call out what we now know is a potential road to impeachment kind of act, that it was, quote, crazy to link the Ukraine assistance to what Donald Trump wanted, investigating the Bidens. We can also confirm Sondland spoke to Trump on the phone during that crucial 5-hour gap between those texts, because he was then the one who, after speaking to Donald Trump, sent the very defensive text claiming that Trump was crystal clear there was no quid pro quo. I want to get right to our panel now. Former federal prosecutor John Flannery, who worked with the Democrats during the Clinton impeachment. David Priest, a former CIA intelligence officer and an intelligence briefer at State. He was privy to some of these kind of call readouts and evidence. He's also the author of How to Get Rid of a President in History's Guide to Removing Unpopular, Unable, and Unfit Chief Executives, and Katrina Mulligan, who represented the DOJ in the National Security Council process and now works at the Center for American Progress. David, what do you see as significant in what unfolded today?
Well, what we see is the president's team trying to throw everything at the wall to see what sticks. And that's not new. What's new is that it's escalated. Now it's an official White House letter saying all of impeachment is invalid. You can't do this. But they have a fundamental problem, which is it's in the Constitution. This is a legitimate function of Congress. And trying to say that the entire inquiry is invalid doesn't really hold water. At best, it's a stalling tactic. The more disturbing thing is politically how the White House is leaving Republicans out to dry, because guess what? You're trying to say at the heart of this is something that is not a problem. There's no quid pro quo. This was just okay to do. On the other hand, you're not allowing anybody to testify about it. Well, if nothing's wrong with it, you should want them to testify and explain why this is okay. They're undermining the eventual political arguments Republicans are going to have to make if they want to vote against impeachment when it comes up.
You lay that out. And John Flannery, we have it here. This is the brand new letter from the White House. Just came into the newsroom within the last hour. And to David's point, this letter, which makes a series of arguments, some more serious than others, doesn't come on a great day for them. It doesn't come on a calm day or a day when they look organized. It comes on, as David says, a day where at the last minute they yanked the guy who, to be clear, was defending the president in those texts.
Right. What they're doing is their policy is to lie and delay, and they've done it in various ways, entirely inconsistent, and none of it has worked. Because unlike the Barr situation, when he characterized falsely what was the Mueller report, we have the documents this time. We have the conversation that the president had with Zelensky. We have Rudy Giuliani's own statements on the air. We have these messages going back and forth, including the one of the chargé d'affaires Taylor saying, what are you guys doing? Linking this local international problem, that is what's happening in America in the election, with what you're going to withhold from them if they don't do what you want to affect the election. So I think that what we have is, and this document they have doesn't have any legal arguments. In the case of impeachment, you are entitled to have a good faith objection.
I got to push back, John. It had some legal arguments in it. I don't think it's accurate to say that it doesn't. It's from the White House counsel, and it's making an array of arguments. Some of them are legal in trying to argue that they haven't formally, procedurally begun the impeachment probe. That might be news to Americans who feel like they have, which is what actually makes it such a legal argument, that it's sort of in the weeds.
Well, to say it's legal when the Congress can start an impeachment just based on a hearing by a committee and doesn't have to have any formal proceeding, and indeed the Constitution requires none, makes that sounding like a legal argument, but not one at all. Another one is it's kind of ironic for the White House to be talking about due process when they're ignoring due process all the time, and the interrelationship between the executive department and the House of Representatives are not responding to formal and proper discovery requests by the House, just as was the case in Richard Nixon's administration, and it became one of the articles of impeachment. And we've been told today we're on the way to doing that in this case.
Well, let me read to Katrina for your national security expertise more that we're learning from the Times coverage of the whistleblower account. There was a conversation underway with White House lawyers about how to handle the discussion because they viewed this. The president had clearly committed a criminal act by urging a foreign power to investigate a U.S. person to advance his reelection bid. What's your interpretation of what we're learning there from the national security experience you have, Katrina?
Well, I think the important thing to remember here is that all of these people work for the American people and for America. They don't work for Donald Trump. And despite that, what it seems like has happened time and time again at each step of the way, we learn that people are acting in the interests of the president, even going so far as to violate the interests of the American people and of our national security in the process.
So what do you think about this reporting? I mean, does that sound to you like something that they're qualified to say? Have you ever seen a situation like that where the staff in the White House think that contact with a foreign official was a criminal act?
I've certainly never seen that. And I think, like many things that we're starting to see, this is a bit unprecedented. But to be sure, everybody involved had a duty to report, to potentially, seek a criminal referral, to investigate, and to disclose. And what we've seen everybody do is exactly the opposite of that.
Right. Which is interesting, given what you've done. David, take a listen to Secretary of State Pompeo's claims this weekend about what is appropriate here.
I feel pressure when I talk to your foreign minister. He pressures me all the time. It's totally appropriate. Okay. Right? Isn't that right? Yeah, it's totally right.
Say the dumb thing.
Go ahead and say it. You can admit it. It's okay. It's completely right. Nations do this. Nations work together and they say, boy, goodness gracious, if you can help me with X, we'll help you achieve Y. This is what partnerships do. It's win-win.
David, as a nonpartisan matter, given your CIA experience, is that right or not?
You know what? Pompeo is not wrong. He's not wrong about the fact that diplomacy is about give and take. It's about quid pro quo. You do this for the country, we'll do this for your country. Or if you do this, we won't do this. That's good government. That's good diplomacy. There's one fundamental difference between that and what we're talking about here. Usually, that is done in service of national interests. Usually things worked out through a National Security Council process, but it need not be. It could be the whim of the president if it is a national security interest. What we're seeing now is the same process being used to pressure countries for a partisan and personal purpose, not for the national interest of the United States. That's the fundamental difference between good diplomacy and an abuse of power that is an impeachable act under high crimes and misdemeanors.
Well, I feel like you just used a lot of words. Did we get to yes or no? Is Pompeo right or wrong?
Pompeo's right that that is what diplomacy is. Pompeo's wrong that in this case that's what it's applying because it is not traditional diplomacy.
John?
Well, you know, one of the things that we're overlooking here are the facts of the case, which is that we had decided as a matter of our policy to give enormous amounts of funds to Ukraine to protect itself from Russia. And the president on July the 18th put a freeze on those funds just before his July 25th call. And he made it very clear that those funds weren't coming until he got what he wanted. And it finally required the Senate to threaten to cut off the budget for the Pentagon in order to release the funds that had already been decided to go to that nation to protect them from Putin, who's the puppeteer, if you will, for our tragic president, Mr. Trump.
I've got breaking news right now. I've just been handed the official subpoena. This is from the Democrats, acting in very, very quick manner from what they threatened earlier today. They have subpoenaed Ambassador Sondland. This was the person that we mentioned at the very top of the broadcast, who was yanked at the last minute from providing testimony. I want to bring back in our panel, John, as a advisor to congressional investigations. I know you would agree this is even faster than usual. I'm going to read briefly from it for your analysis. It says, pursuant to the impeachment inquiry, we're transmitting this subpoena. You must appear October 16th and also produce the accompanying documents. What does it mean?
Well, what it means is they regret sending a simple request. And I'll bet you they decided that here we are, we treat you well, and that you do this. And I have reservations about his statement, Sondland's statement, that, I wanted to appear. He had several conversations with the president. Neither one of them wanted him to appear and talk about those things. I don't know what he's going to do, what he's going to try to assert, but I hope that the committee goes forward now and doesn't relax. And if he doesn't appear, that they use their internal powers, their inherent powers, to force him to testify or to sit in custody somewhere. This is, I worry sometimes that we Democrats maybe too easy on these things. This is a time for warriors, and I don't mean this in a terrible way. We have to start looking at how they're treating us, and we have a lot of data points to show us that they're not dealing straight. They don't want to cooperate. They think that the president is a king, a monarchical individual, and that he can do what he wants. Well, that is not our Constitution. That is not our inheritance from the founding fathers, and that's how we have to deal with these people. We're on notice that they don't care for our Constitution or our laws, and they'll do anything to keep him in office.
A strong rebuke there on a day when, again, if folks are just joining us, the Democrats have now made good on their threat and saying they are subpoenaing Mr. Sondland. Katrina, we put together a little bit of the available public evidence, and it's rare, I think we would all agree, to have a secret foreign policy type phone call between heads of state spill out in the public within a matter of months, and then have the call notes, and then have the president make admissions. So it is striking against the backdrop of them pulling Mr. Sondland, because a lot of this is already known, and maybe that's why they're in free fall, or the White House is struggling. Take a look at this comparison. You have in the whistleblower complaint the assertion that this was to continue an investigation to Biden and his son. And then look at the White House notes. So the whistleblower, you could say, is the person who is blowing the whistle on Trump. And then on the right side, you have White House Trump notes himself saying, lot to talk about Biden's son. Whatever you can do with AG Barr would be great. Then in the whistleblower complaint, they say the request was to speak with Giuliani and Attorney General Barr about this plot. Then in the White House's own notes, Katrina, it says, the president said Giuliani's highly respected. I'll ask him to call you along with Attorney General Barr. If you could speak to him, that would be great. What is the significance to you about the credibility of the whistleblower and really the limited ability of Mr. Sondland when and if he does testify to rebut some of this, if it's that consistent?
I mean, you've hit it exactly on the head. The whistleblower's credibility is about as well established as one could imagine at this point. I mean, virtually every fact detailed in the whistleblower complaint has proven to be true, corroborated by information that was released by the White House, corroborated by statements by the president's personal attorney, by the president himself. At this point, it's really there's almost nothing there to impugn the integrity or credibility of the whistleblower whatsoever.
Yeah. I want to thank my panel. We have had a lot of news here, including what just came in, which is we started with this White House letter, and it got hit back by the United States House Democrats on this subpoena for this key witness, all here unfolding just in the last hour. We have a lot more to get to, so I'm going to fit in a break. John, David, Katrina, thank you so much. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.